everybody. I'm delighted to be present here, and I appreciate the effort made by eINDIA and other hosts and sponsors for this event. For me particularly, this is a learning exercise, and I'm delighted to say that I'm wiser today than what I was yesterday. So I'm deeply appreciative of this gathering. I must also confess, after having heard so many speakers with so many ideas in so many directions, I've actually forgotten what I was supposed to speak on. And I sort of been stimulated to think about so many other directions. But I do recall that I'm supposed to say something on skills-based education. How do we enhance the skills? So this may be a little different from what has been discussed, but not entirely. There will be significant overlap. And you know, I'm a mathematician by training. And I'd like to confess that mathematicians don't like to begin until they have some idea of what they're discussing in a well-defined fashion. So we need to define something before we move ahead and discuss it, so that our concepts, our perspectives are absolutely clear. And we're talking about skills. So I'd like to ask, what exactly is a skill, or what are skills? And I believe this is my definition. You're welcome to disagree with me. So I'm not asking for any agreement. But my definition, and based on that, I will carry forward along those lines. Skills are nothing but knowledge in action. We talk of skills, all I mean is some knowledge input into a system, a human system or a system, and that goes into action. And once that action is implemented, a certain skill is demonstrated. You make that action better, you improve your skills. So it is really knowledge that drives action, and that's skill. You could say, so-and-so is an accomplished gardener. Now, gardening is a skill. But you know, it's not a question of wielding the spade or a clipper or learning about or just distributing fertilizer over a lawn. The idea is to acquire some knowledge. You need to understand what a fertilizer does. You need to know how to wield the clippers. You need to understand what plants need, and then implement that. The action makes it a skill. So there is always, even at that level, a certain degree of knowledge that is being put into action. So let's be very clear on that. And then I come to my second proposition. Once you have a definition, you need a proposition. And my proposition is that knowledge and skills are two sides of the same coin. Make no mistake about this. Let me demonstrate to you why I say that. So you know, some time back, about 8 years ago, I picked up the quarterly report of Google for a certain quarter, 3 months. And for that exact same 3 months, I picked up the quarterly report of one of India's leading IT companies. I'm not going to name the company. And I'll tell you what I discovered. At that point in time, Google had less than 10,000 employees. The Indian IT company had almost 100,000 employees. At that point in time, Google was less than 10 years old. And the Indian IT company was almost 50 years old. Google had fewer situations in different parts of the world. The Indian IT company was stationed in many countries. Now, here's the point I'm trying to make. For that quarter, Google's earnings were 3 times more than the Indian IT company. So put that into perspective and think about it. Both are doing something that requires skills. Programming, putting up servers, putting up web pages, putting up interactivity. What's the difference? I looked at that IT company deeply. I interacted with them. I suggested many things to them. I invited them into my university. No response. The difference is that the IT company has very little knowledge driving its efforts. Pure mechanical work without much thought process. Simple thought processes. That's it. Repetitive. Whereas Google was being driven by a knowledge engine that had come from the corridors of Stanford University. The people at Google didn't really fully create that. That already existed within the undergraduate systems of Stanford. I'm emphasizing undergraduate. Think about that also. So that's the point I'm trying to make. That if you really wish to drive yourself forward either at an individual level or at an institutional level or at the level of a nation, recognize this first and foremost. That knowledge and skills are just two sides of the same coin. And then let me tell you how to go about getting better things through better skills implementation. And I'll do this first by, again, mathematicians, when they give a definition and prove a proposition, and they love to give examples. Nothing like 3-4 examples to make things very clear. You know, I'm a great admirer of Kabir. Great. If you just look at his poetry, forget the spirituality. Just look at it from the literary point of view. Look at the poetry, the rhythm, the choice of words, the meters he uses. Now that's knowledge. But it's knowledge and skills. You have to be skillful at crafting these things. And where did Kabir acquire these from? By all accounts, Kabir really didn't go to any formal system of education. He had one guru. But there is really not much on whether the guru schooled him. I have no idea. There's something else here I want to illustrate. Kabir was a weaver. He was using his hands. He was using his hands. And I have looked at weavers the world over. I have looked at weavers in Andhra. I have looked at weavers of Native Americans in North America. All of them craft marvelous poetry. All of them. You see, there is a rhythm to weaving. There's a certain logic. There's a certain amount of structure. And when you do that with your hands, it stimulates your brain in a certain way. Mahatma Gandhi repeatedly said this. We have forgotten. He repeatedly said this. In education, what you do with your hands will enter your heart. This is the father of the nation. And remember this. Gandhi never spoke on anything until he had experimented and derived conclusions through that experimentation. In the context of education, and I'm deeply saddened that in India we do not pay attention to what Gandhi said and did in education. You know, he first set up a school in South Africa which he ran personally. He was the principal of the school, whatever it means. Then he came to India and he set up a university in Ahmedabad that functions till today. I have never seen that university invited to any conclave of vice chancellors or any discussion on education. But it functions till today. It's a full-fledged university, Gujarat Vidyapeeth. Maybe my friend Dr. Harish knows about it. Think about that. And then, when he went to Wardha, he set up a polytechnic for women. And one more thing, they say he was against science, he was against technology. In this polytechnic for women at Wardha so many years ago, he put on its governing body India's foremost scientists. There was C.V. Raman, there was Jagdish Bose, they were all there on the governing board. And they said he was against science. After all these experiments, Gandhi said, what you do with your hands will enter your heart. And hands and skills are one and the same thing. Why do I say that? I just mentioned Kabir, but you think about this. Just think about it. Jesus was the son of a carpenter. And he helped his father. Make no mistake, look at Jesus' life. He helped Joseph with his work in carpentry. Think carefully. I looked at Michael Faraday. He had no formal education beyond the second grade. In his time, he became the greatest scientist of the world. And all his life, he is doing things with his hands. All his life. He started out as a lab attendant. By then, he had already made great discoveries. But he had no compunction working with his hands in his lab, creating simple things as a lab attendant. And those simple things with his hands were connected to knowledge systems in both ways. They were giving him knowledge and knowledge was giving him those things. That is two sides of the same coin. You must be adept and must be proud of this business. Do not differentiate. I keep hearing policymakers in my country and other parts of the world, skills, put up a polytechnic, skills, put them into +2, skills, put them into vocational. Don't do that too much, please. Keep them connected to knowledge systems. C.V. Raman, one of the most skilled persons with his hands when it came to building apparatus. His entire Nobel Prize winning work experiment cost him less than 200 rupees because he didn't import anything. He built that whole apparatus with his hand. And what have we done in India? Now, whatever that instrument is called is not manufactured in India at all. It is imported from abroad for our labs at great expense. Why? Because we have divorced this business of using your hands from knowledge systems. Our students, my colleague who's not here right now, kept talking about mechanical engineers. I wanted to ask him, how many mechanical engineers have actually ever built anything through their own hands in those 4 or 5 years of their learning? And if they do that, they will have no trouble finding their true place in society. But it isn't just Raman or Kabir or Gandhi or Faraday, Einstein. All his insights into gravitation came because he was managing his father's electromagnetic goods factory. And at one time, even after he had a PhD in physics, Einstein almost thought of giving up his career in physics to run his father's factory because his father was not well. The point I'm trying to make is this. Einstein also was using his hands. His ideas about gravitation came from all the work he did with those magnets, electromagnets. The story is endless. It just goes on and on and on. Newton did what he did because he was skilled. You know, his insights into gravitation come from his experiments on light. I have never seen schools, colleges ever explain why Newton thought of the theory of gravitation. What gave him that gravitation equation, law of gravitation? It's really his work on light. And why did he do work on light and how did it help him? Because he was a skilled craftsman. He constructed all those apparatus for light by himself. As a child, he began to play with light. When he went to this fair near his home, a country fair, his mother gave him some money. He didn't buy any toys. He bought himself 2 prisms, not 1, 2. This was Newton, 2 prisms. Came back, started playing with the prisms, and he saw it splits into 7 colors, white light. Put the second prism, it combines again. That gave him to understand there are 7 colors that comprise white light. And he went on and on with his hands. Then he built his theory. As I said, it's not necessary, but it works both ways. And remember this, in this country we have had a glorious tradition of knowledge and skills going hand in hand hundreds of years before the time of Christ. I'm not talking of chauvinism, I'm not talking of fundamentalism, I'm talking of hard history. People talk of MOOCs. You know, to my mind, the first MOOC was created in India when the Rig Veda, without dilution in content, quality, pronunciation, and the actions that accompany the chanting of any Vedic month, went across the length and breadth of India without change in quality and content. Just think about it. In those days, when there was no technology, they figured out a way of teaching the whole nation per se of the recitation of the Vedas. From the north, Kashmir, to the absolute south here, they knew how to do it in the same style. The length and breadth of the country. But leave that aside. Let's look at practical things. Indian tradition and knowledge systems drove the economy, drove society. And you know, India begins to suffer economically and otherwise after the destruction of knowledge systems in India. Nalanda, Takshashila, and many other universities that we do not know about yet, but which are being discovered by the day, were destroyed. And India begins to decline because they were driving our systems of economy. Pythagoras' theorem was discovered in India for practical needs. व्यवहारिकता इसको हिंदी में बोलते हैं. Knowledge वो व्यवहारिक भी होना चाहिए. सिर्फ माइंड में लेके चलेंगे, it's not going to help us. That theorem was discovered for practical needs of society. And there are records, not my statements, records by Western historians, thinkers, and even Indian now. Only when the white man says something we follow. Which tell us that Pythagoras came to India. Voltaire, hundreds of years ago, writes that there is no doubt that he came to learn from the Brahmins on the banks of the Ganga. This is Voltaire writing hundreds of years ago. There's a professor of history, of maths at Berkeley, almost 100 years ago, writing that he obviously came to India. But we never learned that. And the theorem in India came out of practical needs of society. You had to learn to lay bricks in a certain formation, to build a certain sacrificing fire altar. Exact shape, dimension, area was specified. Geometry had grown out of these practical needs of skills-based construction. Knowledge was coming out of that. Let's not forget that. People say Vasco da Gama discovered the sea route to India. My God, how people falsify history. About a year ago, I met a distinguished professor of history from Portugal, a white lady, and I asked her. She said, no, he had no idea. He was brought to India by an Indian navigator by the name of Kana. And what was Kana doing? Kana was just one of hundreds of shipmen who were constantly taking Indian ships off our western coastline beyond Africa regularly. At this point in time, when Kana and others know how to navigate the seas, and I'll tell you why they knew that. At this point in time, Newton, the greatest mind that has ever lived, deposes before the British Parliament that as of now, science has no means of determining position at sea. At that point in time, Indian ships, Indian shipmen were taking our ships right across. Why? Because they had an instrument with them called Rapalagai. That's the word in Kerala given to that instrument. In the north, it has another name which I've forgotten. But because I'm in Kerala, in Rome, do as the Romans do. Rapalagai is the name they gave it in Kerala. What was that? It was a rope constructed in a special way with knots on it in a logarithmic scale. They understood logarithms much before they were invented in the West. And they used that to determine latitude, longitude at sea. And that's what Kana also used when he brought them. I've come across a book recently again, written by the way, This business of Kana and Vasco da Gama was first brought to my attention by a Harvard professor. Nobody in India talks about these things. Let's take pride, and I don't want this pride to just be there for pride purposes. I want it to inspire us to learn from the past how we could take systems into the future. That's the learning I want to happen. That's what we need to think about. And this business of learning to chart your route, this skill, comes from a knowledge system. Our universities, they were connected to the needs of society. And that was driving the economy. Why was India called the golden bird? Because our merchantmen could travel such long distances with accuracy and carry forward trade coming from India. Incidentally, the calculus was discovered in India 500 years before Newton. Again for practical purposes. And finally, this was discovered first, the first recorded evidences of Bhaskaracharya in the 12th century, where he defines the derivative, calls it tatkalik gati, instantaneous velocity, the exact same word that Newton uses 500 years later. And that calculus kept developing all the way into Kerala, when everything in the north had been destroyed. And again, 200 years before Newton, they knew how to write down the Taylor and Maclaurin series of functions, and using that in Kerala, they charted nautical tables for ships, which then went faster, straighter, better than Western ships, because they were using nautical tables coming out of Indian systems of knowledge. Think about that. Somewhere our university systems have become too insular, and too much of the Brahmanical in this negative sense. Brahmanical has a very positive connotation. But the negative one is this: no, we don't want anything to do. Give us a campus 100 miles away from everything. Give us a campus that is 500 acres. We want to be as far away from society as we can. Don't do that. And get them to work with their hands. That is the thing that I'm forever mentioning. And don't look down upon any skills system. You know, I used to look down upon chartered accountants. Please forgive me. In my younger days, I thought, what is this? It's just accounting. Till I learned that the actuaries of England, much before the engineers, sir, much before the engineers, invented signal processing for actuarial needs. All the terms, all the ideas are there, coming out of this basic skill of being an actuary and learning how to account and use actuarial knowledge for that. Just think about that. And it isn't just that. There is, in mathematics, a very deep theory called the theory of braids. You know what it is about? Braids. Braiding your hair. Choti banana. It started with that. कैसे चोटी बनाते हैं, महिलाएं कैसे बनाती हैं. And from there, just looking at that, mathematical ideas came forward, and it is a deep theory of mathematics. Exactly the same way, there is a theory of knots. It's literally knots as we understand them. गांठ बांधना रस्सी पे. तरह-तरह की गांठ बनती है, सेलर्स बांधते थे. किसी को ध्यान आया कि इसमें कुछ पैटर्न्स हैं, कुछ आइडियाज हैं. That has developed into one of the deepest mathematical theories, the theory of knots. And today, it is used in genetics. Just think about this. रस्सी से गांठ बांधते theory निकली, उसको मैथमेटिकल बनाया, अब वो जेनेटिक्स में इस्तेमाल होती है. कहां से कहां यात्रा होती है नॉलेज की, परंतु तभी होती है जब उसको स्किल्स से जोड़ के रखें. तो मैं यही कहना चाहता हूं. I really don't know what is the distinction between knowledge and skills. Let us not do that. But then we must redefine education first and foremost. भारत की इस समय प्रधान आवश्यकता क्या है कि हम समझें कि शिक्षा किसको कहते हैं. मैं अब समाप्त करने वाला हूं. कभी कभी डर लगता है कि यह न ऐसा प्रतीत करूं कि मुझे सब कुछ आता है. I don't. मैं भटक रहा हूं, इसीलिए आपके पास आया कि कुछ रास्ता निकालना है. But we must find the way by first defining clearly what we think is education. In my dictionary, education is a very personal thing. It is a search inwards. It's a journey of the self to discover who we are. हम कौन हैं, क्या चाहते हैं, इस पृथ्वी पे क्या कर सकते हैं, क्यों आए। अंतर्ध्वनि, द इनर ड्रम बीट, लेट्स कैच दैट। You catch that drum beat, you start getting educated. And you look at the great people who were, in my dictionary, educated. You look at Jesus, no education. You look at Kabir, no education. You look at Mahatma Gandhi, he had no university degree. गलत अवधारणा है लोगों में कि गांधी के पास कोई यूनिवर्सिटी की लॉ डिग्री थी. That degree is not a law degree. He was just allowed to practice it as a barrister. It has nothing to do with university education. 3 साल इंग्लैंड में आपको रेसिडेंस में रहना पड़ता था, 3 डिनर एनुअली अटेंड करने पड़ते थे, एक सरल सा इम्तिहान लिखना पड़ता था, बस. Nothing else. He had no education. But look, who was Gandhi's spiritual guru? The man whom Gandhi says gave him the spiritual path, which helped him become what he became. A successful diamond merchant of Surat. Think about this, Dr. Harish. Successful diamond merchant of Surat. Raichand Bhai. Raichand Bhai was Gandhi's spiritual guru. He was a skilled person. He knew how to trade in diamonds. But he was spiritually evolved through that skill. All of them. भगवान बुद्ध किस यूनिवर्सिटी में गए, गुरु नानक कहां गए थे? So don't connect this with any formal system. The idea is to allow people to discover themselves and you start getting educated. But education never gets complete. जिंदगी बीत जाती है. गालिब ने कहा था कि जाना कि कुछ न जाना वह भी एक उम्र में. Newton said the same thing. They all say the same thing. So let's understand ये जर्नी कभी समाप्त नहीं होगी. समाप्त उसके लिए होगी तो वो ईश्वर बन जाएगा. रामकृष्ण परमहंस, जिनको गांधी ने कहा था कि लिविंग गॉड है. What does he say? So long as I live, I learn. तो ये समझ लीजिए, ये अंतर्ध्वनि को पकड़ के उसके अनुकूल इस पृथ्वी पे चलना कठिन कार्य है, लेकिन हम प्रशिक्षित होने लगते हैं जब ऐसा आरंभ करेंगे. When we start doing that. But then bring in skills and bring in group activity and bring in the needs of society. नन्ही मुन्नी जाने हैं, ये प्रेरित होती हैं, ये इंस्पायर होती हैं जब आप इनको समाज की चुनौतियां दीजिए. मेरे पिताजी ने कहा था, जब गांधी ने कहा कि समाज में चुनौती है इस समय, सिर्फ स्वतंत्रता की नहीं, बेरोजगारी की है, तो उनकी पीढ़ी जुड़ गई, तमाम तरीकों से जुड़ गई. इन चुनौतियों को सामने रखना आवश्यक है और शिक्षा की संस्थाओं को यह रखना चाहिए. एंड यू मस्ट गेट स्टूडेंट्स टू यूज वेरियस नॉलेज सिस्टम्स कंबाइंड विद स्किल्स इन ग्रुप एक्टिविटी. एंड लास्टली, आई एम नॉट प्रिस्क्राइबिंग टू मच, do not undermine the role of technology. For God's sake, do not. I have heard many distinguished speakers say, you cannot replace a good teacher, you cannot replace a good teacher. मैं आपसे पूछना चाहता हूँ, आपके पूरे जीवन काल में आपके पास कितने अपने व्यक्तिगत अनुभव रहे बड़े अच्छे गुरुओं के? मुश्किल से 1, 2, 3 मिलते हैं. I studied at one of India's so-called best colleges, ranked consistently number 1 for the last 20-30 years. मैथमेटिक्स मैंने वहां से पढ़ी, BA ऑनर्स इन मैथमेटिक्स. 10 टीचरों ने पढ़ाया, 8 न पढ़ाते तो मेरा भला था, 2 ने सही पढ़ाया. बाकी मैंने क्या किया? मैं भाग्यशाली था. मेरे सहपाठी, माय क्लासमेट्स, माय कंटेम्परेरीज, दे स्टिमुलेटेड मी एंड वी हैड एक्सेस टू गुड बुक्स. अब तो टेक्नोलॉजी है, स्टिमुलेशन उसके माध्यम से भी मिलता है, मेंटोरिंग भी हो जाती है. छात्रों को बहुत घेरना नहीं चाहिए. There is a study in the United States. Unfortunately, हमारे यहाँ ये studies नहीं उपलब्ध होती है. मैं इनको अमेरिका में फॉलो कर रहा हूँ बरसों से. There's an American study which shows how 2-year-old children, how creative they are when it comes to colors and choice of patterns. Then in 3 years they get more creative. 4 years they start entering kindergarten, creativity goes down. खत्म होने लगती है. और मैंने ये अनुभव किया है. स्कूल के बाद अंडर ग्रेजुएट कम हो जाता है, अंडर ग्रेजुएट के बाद मास्टर्स और कम, और PhD वालों से तो डर लगता है. क्षमा कीजिएगा, इट इज लाइक दैट. वी नीड टू थिंक अबाउट दैट. हम उनको घेर लेते हैं. देखिए, मैंने कहा ना, गालिब ने कहा कि जाना कि कुछ ना जाना वह भी एक उम्र में. आप हद से ज्यादा मत पढ़ाइए, कम पढ़ाइए, सही तरीके से पढ़ाइए. उनके दिमाग को खोल दीजिए, सोचने की प्रक्रिया को प्रज्वलित कर लीजिए. बाकी वो अब जीवन भर अपने से करता रहेगा. कहना बहुत कुछ है, लेकिन ये समय नहीं है. किसी और दिन बात करेंगे. बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद.